The vehicle skidded to a halt, tires biting into the gravel as the monolithic structure of the pepper and pyrotechnics facility loomed ahead. Dani, Sasina, Fuma, Blizz, and Vea climbed out, the air instantly thick with the sharp, stinging scent of sulfur and raw capsaicin. It clung to the back of the throat, a reminder of what was processed behind those reinforced walls. They stood in the shadow of the main gate, checking their gear. A sleek car pulled up behind them, tires crunching rhythmically before cutting out. Nyaya stepped out, keys jingling in her hand, her gaze scanning the perimeter with practiced efficiency. She walked toward the group, the distance between them closing in a few sharp strides. She did not speak, simply nodded to the team, her presence shifting the energy from travel to professional focus. They turned as one toward the heavy steel entrance. The facility stood silent, a massive, windowless block of concrete and iron. Vea reached for the handle, the metal cold and unyielding under her grip. They pulled the door open, the hinges groaning as they stepped into the dark, echoing expanse of the corridor. The team split at the main junction, their boots clicking in unison against the polished concrete. Dani and Fuma turned toward the loading docks, their flashlights cutting through the gloom to reveal rows of stacked crates. Sarchina and Blizz moved along the perimeter, checking the seals on every heavy steel door they passed. Vea took the main corridor, her pace steady, eyes fixed on the shadows pooling in the corners. An hour passed in silence. Then, the rhythm broke. Vea reached the central security office and stopped. The door was not locked. It stood slightly ajar. She signaled the others, and within moments, the team gathered in the hallway. They pushed inside together. The office was empty, stripped of personal items, but the wall told a different story. A massive whiteboard dominated the space. At the bottom, a single note confirmed the final shipment was already departing. The team stood frozen, the reality sinking in. The whiteboard was a blur of ink and red lines as they turned and bolted for the exit. Footsteps hammered against the concrete floor, echoing through the empty corridors. They reached the main entrance, burst through the steel doors, and sprinted across the asphalt toward the car. Nya hit the driver's side door, sliding into the seat as the others piled in. She jammed the key into the ignition, but the engine sputtered, coughing once before dying. A collective breath held in the cramped space. She turned the key again, harder this time. The engine roared to life, a guttural sound that vibrated through the frame. Nya slammed the car into gear, tires screeching as they tore out of the facility lot. The road to the airport was a straight, unforgiving line of gray pavement. They pushed the vehicle to its limit, the needle climbing steadily as the perimeter fence blurred past. Every second felt like a heartbeat lost. They skidded around the final turn, the airport runway coming into view. The team leaned forward, eyes locked on the tarmac. A massive cargo plane sat near the end of the strip, its engines whining with rising intensity. It began to move, rolling slowly toward the horizon. Nya did not follow the runway fence. She yanked the wheel hard to the left, tires screaming against the gravel as the car veered off the road and toward a cluster of private hangars. The team braced as the vehicle bounced over the uneven terrain, dust billowing in their wake. She slammed the brakes in front of the largest bay. They piled out, boots hitting the concrete in a frantic rhythm. The main hangar door was sealed shut, a heavy steel barrier between them and the fleet inside. Dani and Fuma rammed their shoulders into the side door, the metal groaning under the pressure until the lock snapped. They spilled into the cavernous space. Rows of high-performance aircraft sat in the dim light. Nya sprinted toward the nearest jet, her hand already reaching for the manual release. They scrambled up the ladder, the interior cramped and smelling of ozone. Nya threw the master switches, the cockpit lighting up with a flicker of amber and green. The engines behind them coughed, then roared to life. A deep, guttural vibration that shook the entire hangar floor. They were moving before the canopy even fully locked into place. The jets surged forward, tearing through the hangar doors and out into the cooling night air. The runway blurred beneath them as they accelerated, the tail lifting, and they tore into the dark sky. The jet punched through the cloud layer, the night sky opening up into a vast, dark expanse. Below them, the cargo plane was a silent, lumbering shadow against the distant city lights. Nya banked the jet hard, the G-force pressing them into their seats as they leveled out at 30,000 feet. She flicked a series of switches, the radar display glowing with a steady, pulsing blip. She looked directly into the camera, a sharp, sudden grin cutting across her face. "This is about to get crazy and epic," she said, her voice steady over the roar of the turbines. "Hope you enjoy the ride." The camera snapped back to the cockpit view as she pushed the throttle forward. The jet surged, closing the distance in seconds. They pulled alongside the massive cargo vessel, the gap between the two wings narrowing to mere meters. Nya kept the jet steady, matching the speed of the target with surgical precision. The team braced themselves, eyes locked on the target's side hatch. The gap between the two aircraft narrowed to less than 3 meters. Nya held the jet steady, her hands locked on the controls. As the turbulence from the cargo plane's engines buffeted them, Vea reached for the side hatch release, the metal handle biting into her palm. With a sharp pull, the seal broke, and the cabin pressure equalized with a violent hiss. The freezing slipstream roared into the interior, a wall of wind that threatened to pull them out into the dark. Vea braced her boots against the floor, leaning into the gale. Sarcina moved up behind her, eyes fixed on the cargo plane's wing. They had one chance to time the jump between the engine pulses. Nya shouted over the roar, her voice cutting through the mechanical scream. They didn't hesitate. Vea went first, launching herself into the void. She cleared the space, her hand slamming onto the cold metal of the cargo wing, her fingers finding a grip on the seam. Sarcina followed, a blur of motion against the night sky, landing hard beside her. Nya was the last to leave the cockpit, pushing off the edge of the jet just as the two vessels began to drift apart. They hit the surface. The mission had reached its point of no return. Vea slammed her shoulder into the cargo door, the locking mechanism groaning under the force. With a sharp kick, the heavy steel panel buckled inward, and they tumbled into the dim, vibrating interior of the plane. Guards were already waiting, their movements sharp and aggressive. The fight began instantly. Vea ducked a wild swing, driving her elbow into a guard's ribs, while Sarcina swept the legs of another, sending him crashing into a stack of crates. Nya moved through the chaos, her strikes precise and relentless. The air inside the fuselage grew thick with the smell of ozone and sweat. They were winning, but the plane bucked violently as the pilots sensed the intrusion. A guard pulled a sidearm, the muzzle flash illuminating the cramped space for a fraction of a second. The shot went wide, tearing through the side of a wooden crate marked with red warning labels. Inside, the fireworks ignited. A chain reaction of sparks and fire ripped through the cargo hold. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the very foundation of the aircraft. Metal groaned and twisted as the fuselage split open, the internal pressure failing instantly. The plane lurched, its nose dipping toward the earth in a terminal, uncontrolled spin. The world outside the fuselage became a blurred streak of black and gray. The plane tilted, its nose dropping into a vertical dive that pinned them against the shifting floor. Gravity fought them, pulling at their limbs as the aircraft spiraled toward the horizon. Vea scrambled over a pile of burning crates, her hands finding purchase on the jagged metal of the doorframe. Nya followed, her movements sharp and precise despite the violent shaking of the hull. They reached the edge of the opening, the wind howling with a force that threatened to tear them away. Below, the earth rushed up, a dark expanse of terrain that grew larger. With every passing second, there was no time to think, only to react. They pushed off the burning frame together, launching into the freezing air. The spin of the plane threw them wide, their bodies tumbling through the darkness. Vea reached for the release, her fingers gripping the handle and pulling hard. The fabric canopy snapped open, a sudden jolt that jerked her upright. Nya deployed hers a heartbeat later. The ground beneath their feet trembled as the final pieces of the fuselage settled into the smoldering crater. Danny, Fuma, Blizz, and Sarcina emerged from the surrounding brush, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. They stood in silence, watching the orange glow of the burning wreckage reflect against the dark horizon. Vea and Nya touched down a few hundred yards away, the silk of their chutes collapsing into the dirt like discarded ghosts. They walked toward the rest of the group, the heat from the fire radiating outward in waves. Nya reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the remote detonator. She did not look back at the crash site. Instead, she pressed the button. Miles away, the Pepper and Pyrotechnics facility vanished. A series of synchronized explosions ripped through the monolithic structure, turning the entire complex into a towering pillar of flame and debris. The shockwave reached them seconds later, a low rumble that vibrated in their chests. They watched the criminal enterprise collapse into ash. From the shadows of the nearby perimeter, local authorities moved in. They swarmed the site, pinning the CEO against the side of a transport vehicle. The team stood together, watching the final embers fade into the night. The threat was neutralized. The work was finished.